Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? It began, as so many curious cases do, over something trivial. Tuppence Beresford was attempting to balance a plate of scones on one knee while explaining, with her usual confidence, that the British Empire had been saved not by statesmen, but by housewives with strong opinions. Tommy, lounging opposite her in the sunny Hampstead sitting room, offered the faintest smile. "Housewives and strong opinions," he said. "A dangerous combination. Napoleon would never have survived afternoon tea." Before Tuppence could reply, a discreet rap at the door interrupted the domestic peace. Albert, their faithful man of all trades, appeared with the unmistakable air of one bearing tidings. "Lady Ethel Ramsden to see you, ma'am. Says it's urgent." Tuppence blinked. "Lady Ethel? Good heavens, I haven't seen her since that ghastly charity fete in '48. What on earth brings her here?" Albert, who had seen many odd callers in his time, merely said, "She looks a bit flustered, if I may say so," and withdrew. Moments later, Lady Ethel swept in, all tweed and distress. Her once handsome face was drawn tight with worry, and the pearls at her throat trembled faintly as she spoke. "My dear Tuppence," she began, gripping both of her hostess's hands, "I hardly know how to say this, but I am at my wit's end." Tuppence's instinct for trouble stirred like a cat opening one eye. "Then you've come to the right place," she said briskly. "Sit down before you faint or gossip, whichever seems nearer." Tommy rose, fetched a chair, and with that unhurried gentleness which Tuppence both admired and found exasperating, poured tea. The clock ticked companionably on the mantelpiece. The only sound otherwise was the faint rustle of London beyond the window. "It's about Witchmere Hall," Lady Ethel said at last. "You remember my father's old place in Sussex?" "Of course," Tuppence said. "Miles of parkland, dreadful wallpaper, and a lake that never had a fish in it." Lady Ethel gave a strained laugh. "Yes, well, it's not the decor I'm worried about. It's my butler, Mr. Frobisher. He's gone." "Gone where?" Tommy asked mildly. "If I knew that," she said with a little snap, "I shouldn't be here. He disappeared 3 nights ago. Vanished. And a piece of my family silver has vanished with him." The porcelain clinked faintly as she set her cup down. It was a serving tray, 18th century, engraved with our crest. Sentimental rather than valuable, but still, one hates scandal. Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. He was thinking what she was thinking, that when people emphasized sentimental rather than valuable, the item in question was almost always valuable indeed. "Have you gone to the police?" he asked. Lady Ethel hesitated. "I have not. You see, my nephew Julian insists it would only create gossip. He says Frobisher will turn up once he's slept off whatever mischief he's been about. But I know better. Frobisher was devoted to the house. He would never abandon it, or me." Tuppence's blue eyes sharpened. "You sound less certain about your nephew." The older woman coloured faintly. "Julian is modern. He has strong views on economy, which I do not share. There have been discussions about selling certain heirlooms, but that's a family matter. Still, I can't help fearing something dreadful has happened." She reached for her cup again, and as she did, her hand trembled so violently that porcelain struck porcelain with a crack. A thin line split the delicate rim of Tuppence's best teacup, and the sound seemed to slice the air. Nobody spoke for a moment. "Well," said Tommy lightly at last, "there goes the family china. Symbolic, don't you think?" Tuppence shot him a look, but the humour worked. Lady Ethel's lips curved into a wan smile. "I knew you'd laugh," she said. "You always did. That's why I came. You and Mr. Beresford have, what shall I call it, a reputation." "For eccentric curiosity," Tuppence supplied. "For getting into trouble," corrected Tommy. "For solving it," she finished crisply. "You may leave the adjectives to the newspapers." Turning back to Lady Ethel, she said more gently, "Tell me everything from the beginning." Lady Ethel did so. How Frobisher had been with the family for 20 years, how he'd kept the household running through rationing and post-war shortages, how 3 nights ago he'd quarrelled with the housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, about missing cellar accounts. The next morning his room was empty, his bicycle gone, and the silver tray missing from the plate safe. "Mrs. Pell insists he left in temper," she concluded, "but I cannot believe it. Frobisher was punctilious to the point of tyranny, and he adored that pantry of his. You could eat off the floor." "People usually don't," murmured Tommy. Tuppence ignored him. "You said the pantry was his domain. Who has access to it now?" "Only Mrs. Pell. She keeps it locked until we're certain what's missing. I hardly dare to look." There was a faint finality in Lady Ethel's tone, as if she'd been rehearsing tragedy in her head. Tuppence rose and crossed to the window, where sunlight picked out motes of dust. Her mind moved rapidly, slotting details into pattern. "Tommy," she said, "do you remember what you used to call us when we first married?" He grinned. "The blunderers." "Exactly. Well, perhaps it's time the blunderers unblundered again. A missing butler, a piece of family silver, a nervous nephew, and a locked pantry. That's practically a syllabus for us." Lady Ethel gasped, half relieved, half alarmed. "You mean to investigate?" "My dear," Tuppence said, "if we didn't, I'd spend the week rearranging the linen cupboard, and that's a fate worse than crime." Tommy set down his cup and stood. "You realize," he said solemnly, "that this will involve country trains, suspicious villagers, and your unerring instinct for putting us both in mortal peril." Tuppence smiled sweetly. "All the more reason to bring your flask." Lady Ethel looked between them, bewildered but comforted. "You're sure it's not too silly?" "On the contrary," Tuppence said, "silliness is often a mask for something serious. We'll come down tomorrow, if that suits you." "Tomorrow, then," Lady Ethel murmured, rising. She clasped Tuppence's hands again, her rings cold against the younger woman's skin. "You can't imagine how grateful I am." When the door closed behind her, the room seemed suddenly smaller, the afternoon quieter. Tommy wandered to the mantelpiece and examined the cracked teacup. "A pity," he said. "It was part of your wedding set." Tuppence regarded it thoughtfully. "I don't mind. It feels appropriate. Nothing stays perfect forever." He raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of Lady Ethel?" "I'm thinking of Witchmere Hall," she said slowly. "Something's broken there, and not just china." She moved to the window again, watching Lady Ethel's car disappear beyond the hedge. Somewhere in the distance a bell struck 4, precise and melancholy. "Do you believe the butler stole the silver?" Tommy asked. Tuppence shook her head. "No, but I think someone wants us to believe it, and whoever locked that pantry door is guarding more than teaspoons." Tommy smiled faintly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "You realize this means an early train, drafty bedrooms, and the possibility of being poisoned at luncheon." "Excellent," she said briskly. "I've been getting dreadfully bored." He laughed and followed her gaze to the window. Beyond the glass, Hampstead's polite rooftops glimmered in the late light, orderly, content, unsuspecting. Neither of them spoke again until the clock chimed the half-hour. Then Tuppence turned, her eyes bright with purpose. "Pack your bag, Tommy. Tomorrow we pay a call on Witchmere Hall." The morning train from London made a pleasant enough beginning. Soft clatter of wheels, the smell of newspapers and coffee, and Tuppence Beresford's head full of speculation. She had packed lightly but with purpose. 2 skirts, 1 revolver, and a determined sense of curiosity. Tommy, opposite her, was reading the Times and pretending not to notice her watching him over the top of her magazine. "Tommy," she said finally, "you don't find it odd that Lady Ethel didn't mention whether the police searched the grounds?" He looked up. "You forget, darling, the English upper classes consider scandal more dangerous than crime. If she could bury the butler under the rhododendrons without anyone knowing, she'd do it in her pearls." Tuppence smiled faintly. "I think you underestimate rhododendrons." When the train drew into Witchmere Holt, the countryside seemed almost too well behaved. Not a blade of grass strayed from its place. The drive to Witchmere Hall wound between prim hedges and spotless white gates, as though the entire estate had been polished for inspection. Lady Ethel awaited them at the front steps, elegant, controlled, and anxious beneath her hat's narrow brim. "I can't tell you how grateful I am," she said, ushering them inside. "I know you'll treat the matter with discretion." "We're discreet as church mice," Tommy assured her, though slightly better dressed. The entrance hall of Witchmere was a museum of order. Every painting hung perfectly level, every piece of silver glimmered in calculated restraint. The only sound came from a long-case clock that ticked solemnly, marking each second like a witness. Mrs. Davenant, Lady Ethel's companion, appeared from the morning room, a pale, composed widow in dove-grey silk, with eyes that missed nothing. "Tea will be served presently," she said, her voice cool as porcelain. "Ah," murmured Tuppence, "the English cure for all crises." Lady Ethel led them through the ground floor, speaking rapidly. The servants' wing, the library, the morning room, the butler's pantry, locked, of course. "Mr. Frobisher's quarters are just off the pantry," she said, pausing before a narrow passage. "He was meticulous, everything in its place. That's why this is so dreadful. It's not just the theft, you understand. It's the disorder." Tuppence's eyes swept over the polished brass doorknobs and the faint impression of a hand on the wall, as if someone had steadied themselves recently. "When was the pantry locked?" she asked. Mrs. Pell insisted upon it. She feared the servants might, well, curiosity spreads fast in a household. "Indeed," said Tuppence lightly, "and sometimes so does guilt." At that moment, a tall, dark-haired young man entered through the French doors. "Aunt Ethel," he said, with the practised ease of someone accustomed to entering a room and commanding it. "I didn't realize we had visitors." "Julian," Lady Ethel said quickly, "these are Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, old friends of mine." Julian Ramsden offered a charming but perfunctory smile. "You've come about Frobisher, I suppose. Entirely unnecessary, I assure you. He'll turn up once he's had his fun. Probably gone off to Brighton with the silver under his arm." Tuppence regarded him thoughtfully. "You sound quite sure." "Experience, Mrs. Beresford. Servants are loyal until they're not." Tommy said mildly, "You seem remarkably philosophical for someone missing a family heirloom." Julian's expression cooled. "The silver is replaceable. Reputation isn't." And with that, he turned on his heel and left the room. Lady Ethel sighed. "You mustn't mind him. He's under strain. The estate accounts are complicated, and Mr. Frobisher was invaluable. His loss has upset everything." "Quite," said Tommy. "I dare say the butler kept more than the silver in order." The tour concluded in the dining hall, vast, immaculate, and lifeless. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to hold their breath. "Would you like to see the grounds before luncheon?" Lady Ethel asked. Tuppence agreed. Outside, the gardens were beautiful in the sterile way of things maintained for appearance rather than pleasure. 2 gardeners trimmed already perfect borders, and a fountain murmured politely in the centre. Tommy, hands in pockets, observed, "I've never seen so much order in one place. It's unnerving." Said Tuppence, glancing back toward the house, as if the whole place were performing for us. She paused. Through one of the lower windows she saw movement, a maid slipping quickly from view. Not curiosity, fear. At luncheon, the household assembled under Lady Ethel's supervision. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, presided over the servants' table like a general. Broad-shouldered, severe, with hair scraped into a bun, she acknowledged Tuppence with the faintest nod. "I gather," she said in tones of iron, "you're here about Mr. Frobisher. It's a pity. He was a capable man, though prideful. Some men don't know when they're beaten." "Beaten?" Tuppence repeated. Mrs. Pell sniffed. "He didn't like being questioned. About the cellar accounts. We had words and he left in a temper. That's all there is to it." Tommy leaned back. Odd that a man so particular would vanish without collecting his wages. "Perhaps he meant to collect more than his wages," Mrs. Pell said sharply. The silence that followed was thick enough to spread with a knife. Lady Ethel coughed and conversation resumed. Weather, harvest, charity committees. The polite surface returned, but the tension lingered beneath it like damp beneath wallpaper. When luncheon ended, Tuppence begged leave to stretch her legs and drifted toward the servants' passage. She found the butler's pantry door, small, oak, and fitted with a modern brass lock that gleamed suspiciously new. She ran her fingertips over it and frowned. The keyhole smelled faintly of polish and something metallic. A maid came down the corridor carrying linens, the same girl Tuppence had glimpsed earlier. "Excuse me," Tuppence said gently. "You must be Lily." The girl hesitated, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am." "You knew Mr. Frobisher well?" "I suppose. He was strict. Fair, mostly." "Mostly?" Lily bit her lip. "He could be harsh when he thought someone careless. Said order was the soul of service, but he was kind to me, once." Tuppence caught the flicker of emotion. You mean before he disappeared? The girl nodded quickly, then glanced down the corridor. I shouldn't talk, Ma'am. Mrs. Pell says. What does she say? That curiosity's a dangerous thing. Lily's hands trembled as she adjusted the linens. Beg pardon, Ma'am. She hurried off before Tuppence could stop her. Tommy joined her moments later, jingling change in his pocket. Well? She's frightened of something, and I'll wager Mrs. Pell keeps more than sheets under lock and key. He nodded toward the clock at the end of the hall. Ticking like a conscience, isn't it? The whole house feels rehearsed. Everyone knows their lines. Except the missing man, Tuppence said softly. They returned to the drawing room where Lady Ethel waited with tea and nerves. Outside, the sun shone obediently over the gardens. Inside, shadows pooled in corners no one looked at too closely. As the clock struck 3, Tuppence's gaze drifted once more to that locked pantry door down the passage. Its polished surface caught the light and seemed to hold it prisoner. Something told her the key to Witchmere Hall's perfection was hidden right there, behind that door. Don't look so innocent, Tuppence, Tommy said. You've got that expression again, the one that usually leads to someone's butler being grilled under a 40-watt lamp. She smiled sweetly from behind a stack of account ledgers. If you must know, dear heart, I'm reorganizing the household finances. Lady Ethel insists they're in a muddle. And you heard Julian. Accounts that didn't add up. I'm simply adding them up. They were sitting in the small morning room after breakfast. Lady Ethel had excused herself to write letters, Julian had gone to the stables, and Mrs. Davenant was inspecting the flower arrangements like a general reviewing troops. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, had offered to fetch the relevant papers, but Tuppence had insisted on examining them herself. You've become remarkably keen on numbers, Tommy observed. I'm keen on patterns, Tuppence replied, in figures, in people, and in keys. She nodded toward the heavy brass key that lay on the table beside the ledgers, recently borrowed from Mrs. Pell's ring when the woman had stepped away. Within 10 minutes, Tuppence and the maid Lily were standing in front of the butler's pantry door. The corridor was silent except for the faint hum of bees against the glass of the back staircase window. Are you sure we won't be caught, Ma'am? Lily whispered. Not unless Mrs. Pell can hear guilt, Tuppence said lightly. Come along. The key turned with a clean click. The door swung open to reveal a small square room gleaming with polish. Everything was in perfect order, too perfect. Rows of trays, goblets and decanters shone under the filtered light. Yet the air had an odd tang, a mingling of beeswax, silver polish, and something metallic and unpleasantly sweet. Good heavens, Tuppence murmured. One could eat off the ceiling. She moved slowly along the shelves, fingertips tracing faint smears on the edge of one tray. Then she paused. 2 nearly identical sets of silver service stood side by side, one old, deep in its lustre, the other new but deliberately darkened to match. She crouched, running a cloth over one of the newer pieces. Beneath the artificial tarnish, the engraving was clumsy, the Ramsden crest slightly crooked. 2 of everything, she said softly, and 1 too many secrets. Lily watched nervously. Mrs. Pell said she locked the door because of inventory. She said thieves might come again. Thieves often do, Tuppence said, though usually from inside the house. On a lower shelf she found a drawer, locked but not tightly. The metal latch gave after a firm tug. Inside lay envelopes, scraps of paper, and a faint smear of red sealing wax. One corner of a torn letter caught her eye. E.R. must never know. The rest had been burned away. Tuppence folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Evidence, she said cheerfully. Lily's face had gone pale. Mrs. Pell said Mr. Frobisher left in a temper. Did he often quarrel? Not really, ma'am. Only about the cellar accounts, and once with Mr. Julian. About the silver, I think. Tuppence straightened, dusting her hands. Tell me about that. It was 2 nights before he disappeared. I was polishing the glasses in the passage. Mr. Julian came in from the garden, and they started arguing. I heard Mr. Frobisher say, "You'll ruin her if you go through with it." Then there was a crash, a tray falling maybe, and I ran off before they saw me. And you told no one? Lily shook her head miserably. Who would believe a servant girl? Besides, Mrs. Pell said to mind my tongue, said gentlemen's tempers are no business of mine. Tuppence nodded slowly. A most convenient philosophy. Before she could say more, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Lily gasped. It's her. Quick, Tuppence whispered, closing the drawer. They slipped out, locking the door behind them just as Mrs. Pell's solid figure appeared at the far end of the passage. The housekeeper eyed them suspiciously. "Inspecting, were you?" "Admiring," Tuppence corrected with a disarming smile. "Such spotless order. I only wish I could manage it at home." Mrs. Pell's lips thinned. "Cleanliness is a habit, not a miracle." She glanced at the key in Tuppence's hand. "I'll take that, if you please." Tuppence handed it over gracefully. "Of course. I'm sure you guard it better than any police constable could." When Mrs. Pell's heavy tread had faded, Tuppence exhaled. I don't know which is sharper, her eyes or her tone. Tommy found her later in the drawing room, pretending to read a book. "Well?" he asked quietly. "Duplicated silver," she murmured, "and a letter fragment. Someone forged replacements, probably to hide the sale of the originals." Tommy frowned. "Julian again?" "Almost certainly, but I think Frobisher found out, and the quarrel Lily overheard proves it." He dropped into the armchair opposite her. "So what's your next step, my dear Inspector Beresford?" "Talk to Julian, casually, about accounts and temperaments." As luck or fate would have it, Julian strolled in not 5 minutes later, looking perfectly composed. "Settling in, Mrs. Beresford?" "Delightfully," Tuppence said. "Your aunt's house is so well run it almost feels rehearsed." "Rehearsed?" "Everything in its place. Even the servants walk as though someone's written their cues." He laughed lightly. "You must forgive the atmosphere. My aunt likes discipline, and Mrs. Pell enforces it." "I imagine she and Mr. Frobisher were a formidable pair," Tuppence said. Julian hesitated, the briefest pause, before replying. "They were efficient." "And now one's gone. That must make things difficult, especially with the estate accounts, I hear." He gave her a measured glance. "You've been speaking to my aunt." "To everyone," said Tuppence pleasantly. "I find conversation reveals more than ledgers." He smiled without warmth. "Then I wish you joy of it, but I doubt you'll learn anything useful." Tommy, entering just then, said in his friendliest tone, "Oh, we always learn something. For instance, I've just heard from the stable boy that Frobisher visited the bank in Melford 2 days before he vanished. Care to guess why?" Julian's hand stilled on the back of a chair. "No idea. But if he was embezzling, perhaps he needed a last withdrawal." "Perhaps," said Tommy mildly. "Or perhaps he was depositing something, an envelope, say, for safekeeping." Julian's colour rose. "You seem very interested in my family's affairs, Mr. Beresford." "Pure curiosity," Tommy said cheerfully. "My wife collects mysteries the way other women collect hats." Julian forced a laugh. "Then I hope she enjoys this one. Now, if you'll excuse me, accounts wait for no man." He left swiftly, the door closing too firmly behind him. Tuppence exhaled. "Touchy, isn't he?" "Like a cat on a hot griddle," Tommy agreed. "And what do we make of Mrs. Pell?" "Keeper of the keys, literally, and frightened of what those keys might open." She rose and crossed to the window, gazing toward the service courtyard where the pantry wing jutted like a hidden compartment. The sun glinted off its small, shuttered windows. "Tommy," she said slowly, "that room isn't just locked to protect the silver. It's locked to protect the story they've told about it." He joined her, following her gaze. "And the butler?" "Either silenced or waiting for his cue." A clock chimed faintly in the hall. The sound carried through the house like a reminder that time in Witchmere Hall ticked too evenly. Behind every polished surface, Tuppence thought, something trembled, like that first crack in a teacup before the whole thing gives way. It began with a whisper in the passage outside the morning room. Tuppence heard it as she was passing, a quick intake of breath, a soft hush, and then the scurrying retreat of footsteps on stone. When she turned the corner, only Lily was there, standing by the service door with a face as white as her apron. "Lily," Tuppence said gently, "if you're practicing to be a ghost, you'll need more confidence." The girl started, twisting her hands. "Beg pardon, ma'am, it's only... I thought I heard something last night, in the pantry." "The pantry again," murmured Tuppence. "Go on." "I was in the corridor after hours. Mrs. Pell sent me for a warming pan, and I heard it. Someone moving inside, as if..." Lily hesitated, eyes wide. "As if they were dragging something heavy." "And did you tell Mrs. Pell?" "I did, ma'am, and she said I'd had a dream, but she went white as a sheet when I said the latch rattled." Tuppence nodded, filing that away. "Well, Dreams can be inconvenient things, especially when they're true. Thank you, Lily. Now, off you go before your courage evaporates. The maid disappeared, and Tuppence lingered a moment longer in the quiet passage. The polished oak panelling reflected her image dimly. Two of her, one clear, one distorted. A perfect symbol, she thought, for this house and everyone in it. By late morning, the house hummed with forced calm. Silver clinked, papers shuffled, voices murmured, all perfectly ordinary sounds that somehow carried unease. Tuppence and Tommy decided to divide forces. "I'll take the drawing room," said Tuppence, fastening a brooch at her collar. "Mrs. Davenant looks as though she's about to confess something to the curtains." "And I," Tommy replied, "shall tackle Julian. Nothing loosens a man's tongue faster than his own ego." "Try not to start a duel," Tuppence warned. "Not unless he challenges me," Tommy said cheerfully, and sauntered off toward the library. Mrs. Davenant received Tuppence in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and starch. She was arranging flowers with the deliberation of someone who found safety and symmetry. "Such lovely roses," Tuppence remarked. "I always admire flowers that pretend nothing's wrong with the world." Mrs. Davenant's hands paused. "Pretend, Mrs. Beresford." "Well, one mustn't one? Especially in a house where the butler vanishes and everyone carries on as though it were merely a case of mislaid cutlery." The widow looked sharply at her. "You have a quick tongue." "So I'm told. And an inquisitive mind. Dangerous combination." Mrs. Davenant sighed and set down the vase. "You think Frobisher was wronged?" "I think Frobisher was inconvenient," Tuppence said mildly. "There's a difference." A faint smile touched the other woman's lips. "He was a tyrant. Impeccable, but a tyrant. I never trusted him." "Because he was too perfect." "Because he knew too much," Mrs. Davenant replied. "He managed Lady Ethel's correspondence, her accounts, even her confidences. She trusted him more than her own family." Tuppence's gaze sharpened. "That must have irritated them." "It irritated everyone," Mrs. Davenant said, lowering her voice. "Especially Julian. There were scenes, dreadful scenes. He accused Frobisher of interfering, of spying, but it was more than that." "More?" The widow hesitated, then reached for a small envelope on the writing desk. "I wasn't going to mention this, but you'll learn of it eventually. Lady Ethel received a note a week before he disappeared. No name, just this sentence: 'The silver is not what it seems.'" Tuppence leaned forward. "May I?" Lady Ethel kept it in her blotter for days. Then she tore it up, said it was nonsense. But she changed after that, nervous, secretive. I think she suspected someone close to her. "Did she tell anyone?" Mrs. Davenant shook her head. "She and Julian spoke privately, often late. I could never hear what was said, but she came away from those talks ashen." "Thank you," Tuppence said quietly. "You've been very helpful." Mrs. Davenant turned back to her roses. "Be careful, Mrs. Beresford. In this house, truth is treated like silver, polished on the surface, tarnished underneath." Meanwhile, in the library, Tommy was testing his own theories. Julian Ramsden sat behind a desk strewn with estate ledgers, his sleeves rolled up, his manner brisk. "Accounts," he said with a self-deprecating laugh, "the eternal punishment of landed gentry." "I sympathize," Tommy replied, settling into a leather chair. "I once ran a government file room. Half the files were missing and the other half contradicted the first." Julian's grin was quick. "Then you know my pain. The butler kept these records with religious zeal. Now that he's gone, I'm discovering sins of omission." "What sort of sins?" "Oh, minor irregularities, inventories that don't balance, a few missing receipts. He'd been here for decades, so perhaps he grew careless." "Or careful," Tommy suggested. "You said you and he had differences." Julian's tone cooled. "Differences, yes. He disapproved of how I managed my aunt's affairs. He thought me reckless. Perhaps he was right." "You don't strike me as reckless," said Tommy. The young man's smile tightened. "Then you don't know me well enough." Tommy tilted his head. "Forgive the question, but when a man disappears, one wonders who benefits." Julian's eyes flashed. "Are you implying I—" "Not at all," Tommy interrupted smoothly. "But money does make people do curious things. I only wondered whether his absence complicated your inheritance or simplified it." There was a sharp silence, broken only by the creak of the desk. Then Julian laughed, but it rang hollow. You have the most uncomfortable manners, Mr. Beresford. Comes of being married to a woman who solves puzzles before breakfast. Julian rose abruptly. If you'll excuse me, I have a call to make. When he had gone, Tommy glanced at the open ledgers. One page bore the faint outline of an erased column. Figures rubbed away and re-entered. The heading read simply, Silver Holdings. Later, Tommy and Tuppence reconvened in the conservatory, where the air smelled faintly of damp earth and lemon polish. Well, said Tommy, our friend Julian is either a nervous innocent or a very clever rogue. He's rewritten the silver inventory, and not even neatly. Tuppence, leaning against a marble planter, nodded. Mrs. Davenant's given me a note, or what's left of it. The silver is not what it seems. Rather poetic, don't you think? Tommy whistled. So we have forged trays, a vanished butler, and a warning in verse. What next? A confession in rhyme? Possibly, said Tuppence, or a scream in the night. Lily swears she heard something moving in the pantry yesterday. He arched an eyebrow. Frobisher's ghost? Or someone searching for what Frobisher hid. Their conversation was interrupted by Lady Ethel herself, entering with a strained smile. I hope you're both comfortable. Julian tells me you've taken a great interest in household matters. Tuppence smiled blandly. We do like to feel at home. Lady Ethel's composure flickered. You mustn't believe gossip from the servants. Frobisher's absence is unfortunate, but there's nothing sinister in it. Of course, said Tuppence gently, though one does wonder about anonymous letters. The older woman froze. What do you mean? Oh, just something Mrs. Davenant mentioned. A harmless curiosity of mine. Lady Ethel's eyes flashed. Then she steadied herself. That letter was a foolish jest. I burned it. I wish I could burn the talk that followed. Perhaps talk burns itself out, Tommy said kindly. I hope so, she said, almost to herself. Then, in a lower tone, this house breeds whisperers. Even silence isn't safe anymore. She turned and left, skirts brushing the doorframe. When the echo of her footsteps faded, Tuppence said softly, She's terrified, but not of gossip. Tommy nodded. No, of discovery. That evening, the air of Witchmere Hall felt heavier, as though the house itself had drawn breath. Servants moved quietly, doors closed more softly than usual, and the ticking of the great clock seemed louder. In their guest room, Tuppence sat at the small writing desk, sorting her notes. 2 sets of silver, 1 missing butler, 1 forged ledger, 1 cryptic note, and 1 nervous family. It's not theft, Tommy. It's something else, something carefully staged. Tommy poured them each a glass of sherry. Then we're watching a performance. The trouble with plays, he said, handing her a glass, is that eventually the curtain comes down. She smiled faintly. Let's hope we're still in our seats when it does. Outside, the corridor creaked, just once, faintly. Both turned toward the door, listening. The house seemed to hold its breath again. Tuppence whispered, Tommy, did you lock it? No, he said softly, but perhaps we should. He crossed to the door and turned the key. Somewhere below, a clock struck 11, and the sound seemed to ripple through the house like a warning none of them yet understood. It was Tommy who suggested the division of labour that morning. You charm the ladies, I'll charm the ghosts, he said over breakfast, buttering toast with the reckless confidence of a man who had never met a locked drawer he couldn't outwit. Tuppence, sipping her coffee, smiled. Ghosts are easier. They can't flirt back. By 11 o'clock, Tommy was in Frobisher's quarters, a narrow, dignified room off the servants' passage, where everything spoke of restraint. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe orderly, the air faintly scented with tobacco and polish. The man might have walked out moments ago, except for the absence of his hat and watch chain. Tommy's eyes roamed the room, taking in the square-shouldered uniform folded with military precision, the gleam of a brush still holding stray grey hairs. On the wall hung a photograph of the house staff, Frobisher in the centre, expression unreadable. Yet it was the dressing-table drawer that caught Tommy's attention. It stuck slightly, as though resisting curiosity. Inside were the usual relics of service, cufflinks, a pocket-knife, a bundle of letters tied with string, and beneath them a small photograph. It showed a young maid in a plain uniform, smiling shyly at the camera. Her eyes were unmistakable. Lily, Tommy murmured. He studied the photo. It was old, years older than the girl he'd met, but there was affection in the way it had been handled. The edges were worn, the corner mended with tape. He slipped it back carefully, mind whirring. Affection or leverage. From the corridor came a faint knock. It was Lily herself, carrying a basket of linen. She froze on seeing him. "Oh, Mr. Beresford, I didn't know." "Quite all right," he said easily. "I was admiring the late Mr. Frobisher's taste in furniture." Her eyes darted to the drawer, then away. "He kept everything tidy," she said softly. "Didn't like people touching his things." "Even when they were his daughter's photograph?" The basket slipped slightly in her hands. "You found it?" Tommy nodded. "You could have told us." "I wanted to," she whispered, "but Mrs. Pell said it would sound wicked, me claiming such a thing." He frowned. "So you are his daughter?" She nodded, tears welling. "He left before I was born. Came back after the war, said he wanted to put things right. He got me a place here, told no one, said it must stay secret. He thought Lady Ethel wouldn't keep me on if she knew." Tommy's tone softened. "And did she?" "She suspected something," Lily said. "She once asked if I had family nearby. Mr. Frobisher warned me never to answer." Tommy's mind spun. A daughter hidden in plain sight, a master butler with too much knowledge, and a family secret that stank of guilt. "Thank you, Lily," he said gently. "You've helped more than you know." When she'd gone, he lingered, staring at the photograph. A father trying to protect his child, or a man trapped by someone else's secret. Either way, it had cost him dearly. Meanwhile, in the main wing, Tuppence had gained access to Lady Ethel's private study under the pretext of helping with correspondence. Lady Ethel had gone to her solicitor's office in Melford, and Mrs. Davenant was supervising floral arrangements downstairs. The study was a reflection of its owner, tastefully severe. The mahogany desk gleamed, the curtains were drawn just enough to filter daylight, and every paper on the blotter lay squared with military precision. Tuppence's gaze fell on the safe in the corner, open, curiously empty. But what drew her most was the stack of ledgers on the shelf. She pulled one down and turned a few pages. Several entries had been carefully removed, whole pages razored out so neatly it took her a moment to notice the missing sequence. "Missing accounts," she murmured, "the very ones Frobisher argued about." On the desk sat a sealed envelope, its flap broken but still faintly marked with red wax. The wax bore the same hue as that she had seen on the torn letter in the pantry. Written across the front in Lady Ethel's bold hand were the words, "Private, to be destroyed." Tuppence hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing Frobisher's handwriting. "My lady, I beg you to reconsider. The matter cannot remain concealed. You may alter the ledgers, but the truth is not so easily managed. F." Tuppence exhaled. So he had confronted her. And the sealing wax, the same that marked the fragment in the pantry, suggested this was part of a correspondence cut short. She was returning the envelope when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Swiftly she replaced it, straightened the desk, and moved to the window, adopting an air of innocent contemplation. Mrs. Pell appeared in the doorway. "You're in my lady's study, madam." "Quite so," Tuppence said brightly. "I was admiring the orderliness. Remarkable how everything in this house stays in place." Mrs. Pell's eyes flicked to the desk. "My lady values her privacy." "As do we all," said Tuppence, smiling, though some seem to confuse privacy with secrecy. The housekeeper's lips pressed thin. "If you're implying—" "Not at all," Tuppence interrupted. "I merely admire your efficiency. You must have nerves of steel to run such a house." Mrs. Pell said nothing. She inclined her head and withdrew, but not before Tuppence caught the faintest tremor in her hand as she gripped the doorframe. When she was gone, Tuppence murmured, "Nerves of steel, cracking." That night, silence lay thick over Witchmere Hall. The air was still, the moon a pale coin through the landing window. From their guest room, Tuppence could hear the faint rhythm of the clock downstairs. Tick-tock, a sound both steady and menacing. Tommy was already half asleep when she rose quietly, wrapping her robe about her. "Don't startle the ghosts," he murmured without opening his eyes. "If they're polite, I'll let them rattle," she whispered back. She slipped into the corridor, candle in hand. Something had been nagging at her. The note Lily mentioned, the red wax, the duplicity of the silver trays. It all pointed back to one place, the pantry. The house was different at night. Shadows leaned against the walls like eavesdroppers, and the polished floors reflected ghostly glimmers of light. She moved carefully, her slippers making no sound. At the end of the passage she saw it, a dim glow beneath the pantry door. Someone was inside. Tuppence set down her candle and crouched, peering through the keyhole. The sight froze her. A figure stood within, masked by shadow but unmistakably human. The light came from a lantern on the counter, its beam glinting on rows of silver. The intruder wore gloves and moved with deliberate care. Tuppence watched as the figure lifted one of the trays, the false one she saw instantly, its engraving slightly askew, and tapped the underside. A hollow sound. So, there's something inside it, she thought. The figure produced a small knife and began to pry open the edge of the tray. Tuppence's pulse quickened. She almost turned to wake Tommy, but curiosity, that old reckless ally, held her in place. A faint creak sounded from the corridor floorboards behind her. The gloved figure froze, then extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. Tuppence strained to listen. Footsteps moved swiftly, away, not toward her. The sound of the back door latch clicked faintly, and then nothing. She rose and opened the pantry door. The room smelled faintly of metal and wax, the air still vibrating with disturbance. The false tray lay on the counter, its edge slightly bent. Beneath it something gleamed, a flake of sealing wax, red. She pocketed it and whispered, "Not ghosts after all." When she returned upstairs, Tommy stirred as she slipped into bed. "Find your phantom?" he murmured. "Yes," she said softly, "and he's rather fond of lanterns and lies." He opened one eye. "Do I get the details now or over breakfast?" "Breakfast," she said. "The truth always tastes better with marmalade." But long after he'd drifted back to sleep, Tuppence lay awake, watching the pale rectangle of moonlight creep across the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, perhaps behind another locked door, the rest of Frobisher's story waited, as silent and unyielding as the silver that had become its symbol. Breakfast at Witchmere Hall was a solemn affair that morning. Even the toast seemed subdued, as though reluctant to be eaten under such tension. Tuppence sat at the table with a thoughtful frown, stirring her tea with more vigour than necessary. Across from her, Tommy eyed the newspaper he wasn't reading. "You'll stir a hole clean through the saucer," he remarked. She looked up absently. "I'm thinking." "So am I," said Tommy, "mostly about bacon, but still." Before she could retort, the door opened. Lily entered hesitantly, her eyes red-rimmed, hands twisting her apron. The room fell silent except for the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. "Mrs. Beresford," she began, voice trembling, I've something to say." Tuppence gestured gently. "Come and sit, my dear. You look as if you've seen a ghost." Lily shook her head. "It's worse than that. I lied yesterday, about Mr. Frobisher." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. "Go on." Lily's words came in halting bursts. "He wasn't just my father by birth. We'd written letters for years. He found me after the war and said he'd try to make amends. When I came into service here, he told me never to tell anyone. He said the family wouldn't understand." Her eyes filled with tears. "He said he'd put things right, that he was protecting someone, not stealing from them." Tuppence's voice was soft but clear. "Did he tell you what he meant?" "No, ma'am. Only that something in this house was a lie, and if I stayed quiet long enough, the truth would come out." Tommy folded his arms, and then he vanished. Lily nodded miserably. "I swear I don't know where he went, but the night before he disappeared, he slipped a note under my door. It only said, 'Be brave,' that's all." She reached into her pocket and handed them a folded scrap of paper, worn from handling. Tuppence unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was strong, deliberate, Frobisher's, no doubt. Tuppence's gaze softened. "He cared for you. Whatever else he did, remember that." At that moment, the door opened again, and Lady Ethel swept in, elegant but visibly shaken. "What's this I hear about confessions over breakfast?" Tuppence rose politely. Lily was merely explaining her connection to Mr. Frobisher. Lady Ethel's eyes widened. "Her connection?" Lily stood trembling. "He was my father, my lady. I meant no deceit. I didn't wish to shame the house." For a moment, Lady Ethel said nothing. Then she sat down heavily, her gloved hands gripping the tablecloth. "My God," she whispered, "all these years, and I never knew." Tommy said gently, "You had other secrets to guard, perhaps." Lady Ethel's gaze snapped up. "What do you mean?" Tuppence met her eyes evenly. "That the silver Mr. Frobisher supposedly stole, it wasn't the original set at all, was it?" The older woman flinched as if struck. "Who told you that?" "Your ledgers," said Tuppence, "and a certain envelope marked 'to be destroyed.' The copies were made to replace what you sold during the war. A harmless deception, perhaps, until someone began to notice the numbers didn't match." Lady Ethel closed her eyes briefly. "We were desperate then. The taxes, the rationing, Wychmere would have gone under. Frobisher knew. He helped me. We replaced the silver quietly. It was never meant to deceive anyone permanently, only until times improved." "But the lie remained," Tommy said gently. "Yes," she admitted. "He was loyal, too loyal. When my nephew began prying into accounts, Frobisher begged me to tell the truth. I couldn't bear the humiliation. We quarrelled," her voice trembled, "and the next morning he was gone. I thought—" She stopped, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I thought he'd left me, that he despised me for it." Tuppence leaned forward. "You didn't report his disappearance?" "No," Lady Ethel said faintly. "I was afraid of what might be found." Lily's soft sob broke the silence. "He never meant to hurt you, my lady. He only wanted to make things right." Lady Ethel looked at her with something like pity. "Perhaps he did. But truth, my dear, is rarely a comfortable thing." Later, Tommy and Tuppence retreated to the breakfast terrace overlooking the manicured gardens. The house behind them seemed to hum with uneasy life. Servants moving quietly, doors shutting with careful restraint. "Well," said Tommy, pouring coffee, "we've gone from theft to confession to wartime economics. I'm beginning to miss the simplicity of murder." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Don't tempt fate." He stretched his legs, sunlight glinting off the silver teapot between them. "So, what's your theory now, Mrs. Beresford?" "That Frobisher didn't run away at all," she said thoughtfully. "He discovered something, perhaps more than Lady Ethel admitted, and someone made sure he couldn't speak." Tommy buttered toast with exaggerated care. "A touch grim for breakfast conversation, don't you think?" "Truth rarely fits mealtimes," Tuppence replied. "Besides, you've always said I think best on caffeine." He raised his cup. "Guilty as charged. But tell me, if Frobisher knew about the false silver, why stay silent so long?" "Because he loved the family," Tuppence said simply, "and love makes fools of the best of us." Tommy nodded. "You sound almost sentimental." "I'm practical," she countered. "Sentiment with evidence attached." He grinned. "And what evidence do we have? A frightened maid, an absent butler, and enough red wax to start a seal collection." Tuppence tapped the table thoughtfully. "Plus the lantern in the pantry, the forged trays, and a woman who's lying by omission. Lady Ethel still hasn't told us everything." Tommy's tone grew reflective. "Do you believe her story about the silver being sold during the war?" "I believe parts of it," Tuppence said. "The rest, no. The forgery, the secrecy, the missing ledgers, that's all recent. Someone's been manipulating history for profit. And Frobisher got in the way." "Exactly." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of the garden beyond the terrace. Somewhere a gardener's rake scraped gravel. Life at Wychmere continued, polite and poisonous. Tommy broke the quiet. "You know, Tuppence, sometimes I think you like these cases a bit too much." "Like them?" she said, feigning surprise. "Don't be absurd. They're dreadful things, but they do make breakfast less boring." By mid-afternoon, tension hung over the house like invisible smoke. Lady Ethel had retreated to her room, Mrs. Pell had become aggressively efficient, and Julian was nowhere to be found. Tuppence wandered into the drawing-room where Lily sat mending linens by the window. The girl looked calmer, but pale. "Feeling better?" Tuppence asked kindly. Lily nodded. "A little. My lady was kind, after all. She said she'd keep me on, said I shouldn't be punished for another's sins." Tuppence sat beside her. "Did you ever hear your father mention anything hidden? Papers, perhaps, or something valuable?" Lily frowned in thought. "Only once. He said there was something in the house that didn't belong to the Ramsdens. that if the truth came out, it would ruin someone, but he wouldn't tell me what. Did he mention a name? No, just said I'd understand one day. Tuppence patted her hand. Let's hope that day comes soon. That evening, the mood at dinner was brittle. Lady Ethel forced conversation about village fates and church repairs, while Julian toyed with his wineglass in distracted silence. Tommy contributed cheerfully inappropriate anecdotes until Tuppence kicked him under the table. When the meal ended, Lady Ethel excused herself early, pleading a headache. Julian lingered just long enough to mutter something about business correspondence and disappeared into the library. Tuppence leaned toward Tommy. He's nervous. He's cornered, Tommy corrected. And people who are cornered tend to make mistakes. They returned to their room early, the corridors dimly lit by sconces. Tuppence sat at the writing desk, scribbling notes, when a knock sounded, soft but urgent. Tommy opened the door to find Albert, the chauffeur, holding a folded note. "From the village, sir," came by messenger. Tuppence took it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried. She read aloud. "He's alive. Come at once. Melford Inn." For a moment neither spoke. The room seemed to shrink around them. Tommy's eyebrows rose. "Alive?" Tuppence folded the note carefully. "Or someone wants us to think so." He grinned, already reaching for his coat. "Either way, it seems breakfast conversation has turned prophetic." She caught her hat and followed. Let's hope the marmalade wasn't our last comfort. They left the house quietly, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Behind them, Wychmere Hall loomed in silhouette, elegant, motionless, and hiding more than walls could contain. The drive to Melford was the kind of quiet that meant thinking was dangerous. The country road stretched pale and empty under the weak light, hedgerows flashing past like half-kept secrets. Tuppence sat beside Tommy, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, though her mind was anything but calm. "Alive," Tommy said, repeating the word as though tasting it. "That's what the note promised. Alive. You don't suppose someone's having us on?" Tuppence's eyes stayed on the road. "If they are, they've chosen a cruel sort of joke." The Melford Inn came into view, a squat, ivy-clad building with tired windows and a hanging sign that creaked faintly in the wind. Tommy parked beside a horse trap, and they entered to find the taproom half empty, the air thick with the scent of ale and damp wool. The innkeeper, a stout man with sleeves rolled to his elbows, looked up from polishing a glass. "You'll be the folks from Wychmere, then," the innkeeper said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Came quick enough." "We had word there was someone here for us," said Tuppence. "A man with information about Wychmere Hall." The innkeeper lowered his voice. "He took a room 2 nights ago, wouldn't give a proper name. Wrote E. Frobisher in the book, but that weren't him. Said if a Mr. and Mrs. Beresford came asking, I was to show you straight in." He led them to a small back room. On the bed lay a gaunt man, breath shallow, hair greying. On the table beside him sat a torn scrap of paper, sealed with dark red wax. Tuppence went to him. "We're the Beresfords. You sent for us." His eyes fluttered. He forced a whisper. "The mistress knows." "Knows what?" Tuppence asked softly. "Not the silver." He drew one last breath. "The will." His hand twitched toward the red-sealed scrap. Then it fell still. After a pause, Tuppence checked for a pulse and shook her head. "He's gone." Tommy lifted the fragment. "Same red wax as at Wychmere," he murmured. "So somebody's been carrying the same secret up and down the countryside. And now he's carried it as far as he can," Tuppence said quietly. "The rest is ours." By the time they returned to Wychmere Hall, dusk had pooled in the valleys. Lady Ethel met them in the drawing-room, her manner a fragile performance of composure. "Well?" she asked. "Did you find him?" Tuppence's reply was measured. "We found someone who claimed his name, but he's dead now." Lady Ethel's teacup clattered faintly in its saucer. "Dead? My God!" "He had a scrap of paper sealed with your wax. Before he died, he said something very strange." Lady Ethel's voice was barely audible. "What did he say?" Tuppence held her gaze. "That you knew. Not about the silver, about the will." The silence that followed seemed to tighten the air. Lady Ethel went white, her hand clutching the back of the chair. "The will?" "Yes," said Tuppence quietly. "He mentioned it with his last breath. What did he mean, Lady Ethel? For a heartbeat, the woman looked trapped between fury and fear. Then her expression softened into fragility. "I can't bear this," she murmured, and with a small sigh she collapsed gracefully onto the carpet. Tommy knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "She's fine," he said dryly. "Unconsciousness à la carte." "Rehearsed," Tuppence muttered, "just like her grief over Frobisher." When Lady Ethel was revived and carried upstairs, Tommy lingered by the mantelpiece. "She's hiding something deeper. That faint was too perfect." Tuppence nodded. "And her nephew's due for a turn under the light." Julian was in the library, pacing before the window when they entered. "You've had quite a day," he said stiffly. "A trip to the village, dramatic returns. You do keep things lively." Tommy's tone was mild. "You might say the same. You told us you hadn't left the estate since Frobisher vanished, yet the stable boy swears he saw your car on the Melford Road yesterday afternoon." Julian froze. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" said Tuppence. "Because the man we found at the inn was using your butler's name. Perhaps you went to meet him, or to make sure he stayed quiet." His jaw tightened. "You're implying murder now?" "Not yet," Tuppence said softly. "But I am implying knowledge. What was in that will?" He turned sharply. "Nothing that concerns you." "On the contrary," said Tommy, "we're waist deep in your family's lies. You might as well toss us a rope." Julian's composure cracked. "It wasn't about the money. My aunt changed the will months ago. She meant to leave everything to charity, the hall, the land, all of it. Said the Ramsdens had done enough harm. Frobisher found out, threatened to tell me, said he'd force her to be honest. He thought he was doing good." "And you?" asked Tuppence. He hesitated. "I told her she'd regret it, that it would ruin us both. But I didn't hurt him, I swear it. When he disappeared, I thought she'd sent him away." Tuppence studied him closely. "Then who wrote the note from the inn?" "I don't know," he said wearily. "But whoever it was, they've dragged our name through mud." Later that night, Tommy and Tuppence sat before the small fire in their room, the flickering light drawing long shadows across the carpet. "Well," said Tommy, "we've got ourselves a dying man with the butler's belongings, a forged will, and a family behaving like understudies in a Greek tragedy." Tuppence poured herself a nightcap. "You're forgetting the most interesting part, Lady Ethel's performance. Her faint wasn't grief, it was fear." He nodded. "Because if the will comes to light, she stands accused of fraud." "Or worse," Tuppence said thoughtfully. "Perhaps she's protecting someone else. Julian, for instance." Tommy sighed. "You think she altered the will to keep him safe?" "I think she altered it because someone told her to." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight. From somewhere below, a floorboard creaked. One slow, deliberate step. Both turned their heads toward the door. Tommy whispered, "No rest for the wicked." Tuppence stood listening. The steps retreated down the corridor. "Whoever's walking," she said quietly, "isn't worried about sleep, only about what might wake." Tommy smiled faintly. "I've married a poet." "Detective first," she said, "poet later. Tomorrow we find out whose will everyone's dying for." The fire crackled, sending a thin trail of smoke curling into the dim air, the last fragile sign of warmth in a house grown cold with secrets. The first sound was the rattle of the shutters, not the delicate tremor of a passing breeze, but a sharp, deliberate knocking, as though someone were testing the windows for weakness. Tuppence looked up from her notes, frowning. "That's the third time," she said. "If this house grows any jumpier, it'll start confessing of its own accord." Tommy, seated near the hearth with a cigarette, grinned faintly. "The old place is just protesting the weather. English manners hate being dramatic unless supervised." "Then perhaps it should hire an agent," she replied, "because something is performing tonight." Outside, the storm had risen to a low, continuous growl. Rain hissed against the glass and distant thunder rolled over the downs like slow applause. Yet even beneath the storm, the house seemed alive, sighing, shifting, listening. Lady Ethel had retired early with a headache. Mrs. Davenant was resting her nerves, and Mrs. Pell had gone to check the shutters. Julian, notably, was absent. Tuppence set her notebook aside and rose. "Let's take a turn downstairs. If I sit here much longer, I'll start imagining footsteps." They stepped into the corridor, the air cool and faintly scented with lavender polish. A single lamp glowed at the far end. Their reflections followed them in the panelled walls, wavering with every flash of lightning. As they reached the servants' passage, Tuppence stopped short. "Look," she whispered. Across the polished floor ran a trail of muddy footprints, small, uneven, leading directly toward the butler's pantry. Tommy crouched. "Fresh," he said. "Too small for Julian, too large for Lily. And no one's been out tonight, according to Mrs. Pell." Tuppence's eyes narrowed. "Unless someone's been somewhere they shouldn't." The pantry door was locked, but the keyhole gleamed faintly, damp around the edges, as though it had been used recently. "I don't like this," Tuppence murmured. "Not one bit." Tommy straightened. "I'll check the study. If our host's nephew has been up to extracurricular activities, I'd rather find him before he finds us." He found Julian 10 minutes later, slipping along the gallery with a satchel under his arm and an expression of fierce determination. "Evening stroll?" Tommy said pleasantly. Julian froze, then turned with a strained smile. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get some work done." "With luggage?" "Documents," Julian said quickly. "Private ones." Tommy gestured toward the study door. "Then let's review them together. Sharing is such a civilized habit." For a moment, Julian looked as though he might refuse. Then, realizing resistance would be worse, he sighed and entered the study, setting the satchel on the desk. The fire had burned low, casting the room in restless half-shadows. Tuppence slipped in silently behind them, her face cool and alert. "Late-night accounting?" she asked. Julian scowled. "If you're going to interrogate me, at least have the decency to do it properly." "Oh, we've given up decency for Lent," Tuppence replied. "Open the satchel, please." He hesitated, then unclasped the flap. Inside lay several folded papers, bound with ribbon, and something metallic that caught the light, a small brass key. Tommy whistled softly. "The key to the pantry, by any chance?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Yes, I took it from Mrs. Pell. I meant to put it back." "And the papers?" Tuppence asked. He passed them over with the air of a man cornered. "Draft copies of the will, my aunt's and another version, the one I meant to propose." "Propose," Tuppence repeated. "That's a charming euphemism for forgery." He slammed his fist on the desk. "You don't understand. My aunt was ruining us. Everything, the estate, the land, to some blasted charity. After all I've done to keep the place running, I meant only to correct her mistake." "By rewriting her will without her knowledge," Tommy said mildly. "A practical solution." Julian's voice cracked. "Frobisher found out. He was supposed to deliver the draft to the solicitor, and he realized the signatures didn't match. He came to me, said if I didn't confess, he'd tell her himself." "And you accused him of blackmail?" Tuppence asked. Julian hesitated. "He was blackmailing me, or near enough. He said he'd keep quiet if I gave him money for Lily. Said she deserved a future. He knew I couldn't afford to lose everything. I paid him what I could, but it wasn't enough." "Then he vanished," said Tuppence. "Yes," Julian said bitterly. "And everyone assumed he'd stolen the silver. Convenient, wasn't it? But I didn't touch him, I swear it." Tuppence studied him carefully. His confession had the weary ring of truth, and yet something in it felt incomplete, like a page torn from a diary. "You say you didn't hurt him," she said softly, "but you knew where he went." He met her eyes for a long moment, then looked away. "He said he was leaving, that he'd go somewhere safe until he could decide what to do. I didn't ask where. I was relieved to see him go." "Relieved," Tommy repeated. "And when the man at the inn appeared under his name," Julian's voice dropped. "I thought perhaps he'd sent someone to fetch me, to make me pay more. That's why I went there yesterday. But when I arrived, he was already dead." "You didn't mention that before." He flinched. I panicked. The police would never believe me. Tuppence tapped the brass key on the desk. "And tonight?" "I went to the pantry to find the letter he left. He said he'd hidden it there, proof that the forgery was mine alone. I thought if I destroyed it." His voice trailed off. "But the lock was stuck. I never got in." Lightning flashed, filling the room with stark white light. For an instant his face looked almost spectral, guilt carved deep into it. Tuppence's tone softened. "Julian, listen to me. If you're telling the truth, someone else already knows what's in that letter, and they're using it to control you." He stared at her, lost. "Who?" "That," she said, "is what we mean to find out." When he had gone, Tommy exhaled. "Do you believe him?" Tuppence was silent a moment, then said, "Partly, but I think our dear Julian's story is missing its final act." She crossed to the window and peered through the rain-streaked glass. The gardens were black, the fountain a pale blur. Somewhere out there, lightning illuminated the gravel path, and something else. "Tommy," she said quietly, "look." 2 figures were moving across the lawn, one holding a lantern. The light bobbed uncertainly, glinting off wet stone. "Servants?" Tommy suggested. "Not likely. Mrs. Pell would sooner drown than step outside in this weather." She watched as the lantern paused near the east wing, the one that held the pantry and the service cellar. The light vanished through a side door. "Come on," she said. They slipped from the study, the storm muffling their footsteps. The corridor leading to the service wing was half dark, the lamps flickering from the draught. As they neared the pantry, Tuppence's heart quickened. The door stood ajar. Inside, a faint glow from a lantern cast long, quivering shadows across the silver shelves. Someone was there, bent low, rummaging. Tuppence caught a glimpse of a heavy skirt and the glint of steel-grey hair. Mrs. Pell. "What are you doing?" Tuppence demanded. The housekeeper whirled, the lantern swinging wildly. "You frightened me half to death." "I imagine that takes practice," Tuppence said evenly. "Searching for something?" Mrs. Pell's face was tight. "I heard noises. Thought a window was open." "In a locked room?" Before the woman could answer, Tommy bent down and picked something off the floor, a folded scrap of paper, its corner marked with the familiar smear of red wax. "Lost something?" he asked. Mrs. Pell snatched it too quickly. "Household inventory, my duty, sir." Tuppence's gaze held hers. "And your duty includes unlocking the pantry after midnight." Mrs. Pell's lips pressed together. "You've no right to question me in my own house." "Your house?" Tuppence repeated softly. "That's an interesting way to put it." For a moment, the 2 women faced each other, silence crackling between them louder than thunder. Then Mrs. Pell turned sharply, setting the lantern down. "I'm too old for games, madam. I serve my lady, not gossip." She brushed past them and left, the door banging behind her. Tommy exhaled. "She's rattled." "She's terrified," Tuppence corrected, "which means she knows more than she's meant to." She bent to examine the floor. The muddy footprints they'd seen earlier were still visible, and now there were fresh ones overlaying them. A man's boots, heavier tread. Tommy frowned. Julian? Or someone following him? She looked up at the shelves, eyes narrowing. And this? She lifted the bent tray from the night before. Its edge had been pried open a little further, revealing the hollow inside. Someone's been digging for whatever was hidden here. Did they find it? Tuppence shook her head. No, or they wouldn't have come back. By the time they returned to their room, dawn was still far off. The storm had passed, but the air felt heavier, thick with unanswered questions. Tommy loosened his tie. So, Julian forged the will, Frobisher caught him, someone else used that knowledge for blackmail, and now the pantry's become the confessional booth of Witchmere Hall. Tuppence smiled faintly. Exactly. And if my instincts are right, the missing butler hasn't left at all. Tommy raised an eyebrow. Alive? Alive, she said, watching, waiting for the curtain to rise. He gave a low whistle. And who do you suppose holds the spotlight? Her eyes drifted toward the ceiling, where the wind whispered faintly through the chimney flue. The one person no one suspects. Yet. The clock chimed once, solemn and low. In the silence that followed, both of them heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard outside their door, deliberate, measured, and close. Tommy reached for the lamp switch, plunging the room into darkness. Don't move, he whispered. Through the crack beneath the door, a shadow paused, then slowly retreated down the hall. Tuppence's voice was barely audible. You see, Tommy, even the shadows in this house have secrets. Dawn came cautiously to Witchmere Hall, a shy grey light that crept through the curtains as though uncertain of its welcome. The storm had passed, leaving the house hushed and damp, the air heavy with the scent of wet wood and lilies from the garden. In the dining room, Tommy found Tuppence already dressed, her hair pinned with military precision and her eyes bright with purpose. She stood at the window, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Planning an ambush before breakfast, he asked. An invitation, she corrected. We're about to have a family gathering, the kind they'll never forget. He raised an eyebrow. "And what's the occasion?" "The truth," said Tuppence, "and a little theatre." She turned brisk and efficient. "I told Lily to spread word that I found the real silver service, the one everyone's been whispering about. They'll all come running. Greed, curiosity, guilt, whatever suits them." Tommy grinned. "You do love an audience." She smiled faintly. "It's the only way to make liars confess. They can't resist correcting you." By 7:30, the household was assembled in the hall outside the pantry. The air crackled with unease. Lady Ethel, pale but regal in a silk robe, leaned on her cane. Julian stood near the door, trying for indifference but failing. Mrs. Pell hovered behind them, wringing her hands, while Mrs. Davenant watched from the edge of the group, her sharp eyes darting like a bird's. Tuppence faced them all, composed and polite. "Thank you for coming down so early," she said. "I wouldn't dream of disturbing your rest, except that this concerns the reputation of the house, and of its servants." Lady Ethel's lips tightened. "You said you'd found the missing silver." "I did," Tuppence said smoothly. "In the pantry, or rather, behind it." She gestured to the door, which Tommy now unlocked. The room beyond was neat as ever, shelves gleaming, rows of plates catching the morning light. But something new had been placed on the central counter, a silver tray, burnished to a deceptive brightness. Julian frowned. "That's not—" "Ah," Tuppence interrupted. "You recognize it, then?" He hesitated. "Only that it's one of the copies. We've seen that before." "Indeed," said Tuppence, "but this one isn't empty." She lifted the tray carefully, showing the edge that had been pried open. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, sealed with red wax. "I took the liberty of investigating," she said lightly. "It seems Frobisher used this as a hiding place, for a letter, addressed to Lady Ethel herself." The older woman's face drained of colour. "What nonsense is this?" "Not nonsense," said Tuppence. "A confession, perhaps, or a warning. He wrote it the night before he vanished." She handed it to Tommy, who broke the brittle seal and read aloud. "My lady, I have learned the truth about the will and Mrs. Davenant's part in it. I can no longer stand by while deceit stains this house. I will see justice done, even if I must hide to do it. Frobisher." Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Davenant's composure cracked visibly. "Lies," she whispered. "All lies." Julian turned on her sharply. "You were involved?" She flinched. "Your aunt asked me for help. She was terrified you'd ruin her, or expose what she'd done. I only drafted the changes at her request. She promised she'd make things right later." "Enough!" Lady Ethel's voice rang out. "You will not drag my name through the mud with your cowardice." "Then tell them," said Tuppence quietly. "Tell them why Frobisher disappeared." Lady Ethel's eyes glittered. "Because he betrayed me. He meant to expose the will, to destroy the family name." "On the contrary," said Tuppence, "he meant to save it." The silence that followed was heavy. The ticking of a nearby clock sounded like footsteps approaching doom. Then, faintly, from somewhere within the pantry wall, came another sound, a low thud. Every head turned. Tommy stepped closer. "What in heaven's name?" Another sound, a scraping, then a weak cough. Tuppence's eyes widened. "He's alive!" She crossed the room in 3 strides, running her hands along the back panelling. There, half hidden behind a tall cupboard, was a seam in the wood. Tommy grasped the edge and pulled. With a groan of hinges, a narrow door swung open. The smell of stale air and candle wax drifted out. Inside, in the dimness of a hidden passage, lay a man, gaunt, pale, but unmistakably Frobisher. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, and one arm bound in a makeshift sling. He blinked at the sudden light, shielding his eyes. "Mrs. Beresford," his voice was a rasp. "You found me." Lily cried out and rushed forward, falling to her knees beside him. "Father." He smiled faintly. "Hush now, my girl. All's well enough." Tuppence crouched beside them. "You're safe now, Mr. Frobisher. But we'll need the truth, all of it." He nodded weakly. "I heard them talking, in the study, Lady Ethel and Mrs. Davenant, about the will. They meant to change it, to erase the debts, hide the sale of the silver, keep the house in their name. Julian found out, threatened them. They turned on me, thought I'd gone to the solicitor." His gaze moved toward his mistress, who stood frozen at the doorway. "I meant to flee, but when I came down here I overheard them again. I stayed hidden. Then someone struck me, I don't know who. When I woke I was trapped. I've been living off the water pipe and what food Lily slipped me. I dared not show myself." "If someone took my name at the inn," Frobisher whispered, "he was sent by them to mislead you. I never left this house." "There was another man," Frobisher whispered. "One of the old staff they paid off. They used him to carry letters and lies. If he took my name, it was at their bidding. They wanted any trail to point away from this house." Lady Ethel's hand trembled on her cane. "He lies. The man's delirious." Julian's face twisted. "You tried to kill him." "I protected this family," she cried. "Do you think I'd let a servant ruin generations of respectability? I did what had to be done." "By forging your husband's will," said Tuppence coldly, "by paying Mrs. Davenant to hide the evidence, and by letting the man who served you faithfully rot in your own walls." For a long, terrible moment no one spoke. Then Lady Ethel's mask broke. She sank into a chair, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You don't understand. The estate was drowning, the war, the taxes, all of it falling on me. Julian was reckless. I sold the silver to pay the debts. If society had known, we'd have been ruined, so, yes, I forged the papers. But it was Davenant who suggested the details. She said Frobisher could be bought off, and when he refused—" Mrs. Davenant's voice cut through the confession like a knife. "You said he was dangerous. You told me to keep him quiet." Lady Ethel turned on her, her face white with fury. "I said warn him, not—" She broke off, realizing what she'd admitted. Tuppence stepped forward, calm amid the chaos. "So the betrayal wasn't his, Lady Ethel. It was yours." Frobisher's voice was faint. "She planned to change the will, to make it seem her late husband left everything to charity. The charity was false. The accounts led to her own investments." Tommy let out a low whistle. "A tidy bit of embezzlement disguised as virtue." Julian looked at his aunt in horror. "You used father's name. You used mine. All this time." Lady Ethel's lips trembled. "I did it for you, Julian. For the family." He shook his head slowly. "You did it for yourself." Then he turned toward the door. "I'm going to the police." She rose suddenly, her voice commanding. "You'll do no such thing." He stopped. "You can't stop me now." "Oh, I can," she said, with the calm certainty of a woman who has given up pretending. "If I fall, you fall with me. Every check you signed, every account you touched, all of it tied to my name. They'll call you my accomplice." Julian went very still. "You knew. You planned it that way." "Of course I did." Her smile was faint, tragic and terrible. A Ramsden always keeps control. For a moment the room was silent, but for the faint crackle of the lamp. Then Tommy said quietly, "You've just written your own confession, my lady." Her eyes flicked toward him, cold and resigned. "Perhaps, but what does it matter now? The world doesn't care for old scandals. It cares for survival." Frobisher stirred, voice thin but steady. "Survival built on betrayal won't last, my lady." Lady Ethel turned toward him slowly. "And you, my faithful servant, should have stayed in your place." But she didn't see Julian move. He stepped forward, his face pale with something between shame and rage. "No, Aunt. It's time someone else stayed in theirs." He reached for the telephone on the wall. "I'll call Inspector Havering in Melford. He'll take it from here." For the first time, Lady Ethel looked old. Her defiance slipped away, leaving only exhaustion. "If you must," she whispered. Tuppence knelt beside Frobisher, pressing a hand to his arm. "We'll get you to a doctor. You've done enough hiding." He smiled faintly. "I thought no one would believe me, but you did." "I've learned," she said softly, "that truth often hides where it's most inconvenient." Tommy joined her, glancing at the shattered remains of gentility around them. The trembling mistress, the pale nephew, the broken servant. "Well," he said, "it seems breakfast will be rather late." Tuppence smiled wryly. "It usually is after justice." As the police car later carried Lady Ethel and Mrs. Davenant away, the morning sun finally broke through the mist, turning the damp stone of Witchmere Hall to gold. In the pantry, the silver trays gleamed innocently once more, empty now of secrets. And at the threshold, Tuppence paused, looking back one last time. "Do you know," she said quietly to Tommy, "it wasn't the butler who betrayed anyone. It was pride." He offered his arm. Pride and polish. Deadly combination. They walked out together into the light, leaving behind the echoes of lies that had clattered like cutlery in the dark. By noon the next day, Witchmere Hall had the uneasy calm of a stage after the final act. The audience gone, the lights dimmed, and only the echoes of what had been said still lingering in the air. The police cars had come and gone, their tyres marking the wet gravel in grim symmetry, and the last uniformed figure had closed the great oak doors behind him. Tuppence stood by the window of the morning room, watching as the constable's car vanished down the drive. The house, so proud in its Georgian symmetry, looked suddenly frail, as though it too were ashamed of the lies it had harboured. Tommy entered with 2 cups of tea balanced precariously on a tray. "The lady of the house being temporarily indisposed, I thought I'd assume domestic command," he announced cheerfully. She turned and smiled faintly. "It's quieter now, almost indecently so." He set the tray down. It's the silence after confession. Even houses seem lighter once secrets are dragged into daylight. She sat opposite him, the faint clink of porcelain filling the pause between them. For the first time since their arrival, the air in Witchmere felt breathable. "Lady Ethel's solicitor came," Tommy said after a moment. He looked as though he'd swallowed his pen when the inspector told him about the forged will. They'll charge her with fraud and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Mrs. Davenant too, of course. Tuppence nodded slowly. "I almost pity her. Pride and desperation are an old English partnership." Tommy sipped his tea. "And poor Frobisher?" "Resting," she said softly. "The doctor says he'll recover, though he's lost a great deal of strength. Lily's gone to sit with him. She'll take him home to her lodgings in Melford when he's fit enough." "He'll never serve again, I suppose." Tuppence shook her head. "He said he'd had enough of loyalty, at least the kind that's rewarded with locked doors and betrayal." Tommy set down his cup with a thoughtful sigh. "You know, I rather liked the fellow. Solid as a rock, even when the ground was rotten beneath him." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the faint patter of returning rain against the windows giving the room a quiet rhythm. The same rain that had accompanied their arrival now seemed softer, almost forgiving. At length Tuppence said, "Do you know what strikes me most about this case?" "That you were right all along," Tommy suggested. She smiled wryly. "That too, but no. What strikes me is that the whole mystery revolved around silver, something bright, valuable, but so easily tarnished. And in the end, it wasn't the silver that mattered at all. It was the people polishing it, or pretending to." He tilted his head. "You're becoming philosophical." "Merely observant," she said. "Lady Ethel thought she could keep her world intact with lies. Frobisher believed in duty so deeply that it nearly killed him. And Julian, well, he'll carry the shame of the Ramsden name far longer than the law ever could." Tommy stirred his tea, watching the liquid swirl. "So the real silver wasn't in the pantry after all?" Tuppence nodded. "No, the only true silver in this house was loyalty, dull with neglect, a little bent, but still capable of shining once someone cared to clean it." Tommy leaned back with a grin. "You sound like a sermon in pearls." "I'm tired," she said simply. "Tired of people thinking deceit is clever." He reached over, covering her hand with his. "And yet you never stop chasing it." "That's because someone has to," she replied, her voice softening. "If you don't, the world ends up believing the cleverest liar wins." Tommy smiled. "I'd say our little amateur agency has done its bit for honesty this week." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lily stood there, her eyes red but calmer. "He's sleeping now," she said quietly. "He asked me to thank you, both of you. Said he never thought anyone would see the truth clear again." Tuppence rose and took the girl's hand. "You've done more for him than you know, my dear. He'll mend faster with you near." Lily gave a small, watery smile. "We'll leave this place as soon as he's strong enough. It's too full of ghosts." When she'd gone, Tommy exhaled softly. "She's right. Even the ghosts look exhausted." The afternoon drifted by in slow domestic fragments. The murmur of servants packing away unused china, the echo of doors closing, the smell of wet heather blowing in through the cracked window. At 4 o'clock, Tuppence poured another round of tea. The ritual felt cleansing, like reclaiming something simple and good. Tommy eyed the tray. No cracked cups this time. She gave a little laugh. No cracks, no deceit. Just proper tea. He raised his cup solemnly. To uncracked teacups and tidy endings. To lessons learned, she added. He leaned forward, the mischievous glint back in his eye. Though, between you and me, perhaps next time we could take on something simple. A missing umbrella, for instance, she chuckled. Knowing us, the umbrella would belong to a duke and conceal a microfilm of state secrets. Or hide a dagger, he said cheerfully. We're never so lucky as to find mere rainwater. Tuppence smiled, watching the way the steam curled upward. You know, Tommy, perhaps the world would be a duller place if people behaved sensibly, but I wouldn't mind a week or two of dullness. He leaned back, stretching. You say that now, but the moment a strange letter arrives, you'll be packing your case before I've finished my toast. Possibly, she admitted, eyes twinkling. But until then, I intend to enjoy every ordinary minute. Outside, the rain softened to a patter against the glass. Steady, rhythmic, domestic. The gardens beyond shimmered faintly under the damp light, the storm's violence erased as though it had never been. Tommy stood and crossed to the window. Look, he said, the sun's making a half-hearted appearance. Even nature likes tidy conclusions. Tuppence joined him, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. For once I agree with nature. They watched as the clouds thinned, revealing a pale gleam of sky above the drenched lawns. Somewhere below, a servant shut the pantry door with a final click, sealing the room that had held so many secrets. Tuppence turned back toward the tea table and set her cup down with delicate precision. The porcelain made a soft, perfect sound. No crack, no tremor. She smiled. There, whole again. Tommy nodded. Symbolic, I presume. Of course, she said. Every good mystery needs a symbol. He gave a mock sigh. And here I was hoping for peace. Peace, she said, is simply the pause before the next case. Their laughter mingled quietly with the whisper of rain, the kind that carried no storm behind it, only a calm, reflective rhythm. As the light faded, Witchmere Hall settled into its new silence, not guilty this time, but cleansed. A house that had finally confessed and could now rest. And in the small, familiar gesture that had begun it all, Tuppence reached for her teacup once more, lifting it with care, her fingers steady, her eyes thoughtful, and set it down again, uncracked, untroubled. The sound of rain softened on the glass, the last echo of a house redeemed. Fade out.